Welcome to our seventh and last lecture of the term, and in a way the thing that holds it all together in the medieval view where everything starts from the Word made flesh, in God, and God ordered everything according to number and weight. So word order is incredibly important. You have to get the order right to understand the world and to have the system in place. And we have the best possible speaker for this topic today, embodying a kind of institutional memory of paper 4, having been taught the same paper by Chris Wells in the room, which is now the reading room across the corridor, and then lecturing with Howard Jones on the paper while doing a doctorate in Birmingham on Manchester, I should remember that, on early New High German, and among these things on word order. So over to you, Victoria, and many thanks for speaking to us.
Thanks very much. Hello, everybody. I've just put my email address up here. Any questions that you have, please feel free to get in touch. I'm very happy to answer any queries. I think Henrik is going to be uploading the slides to Canvas as well, so it'll be on there. Don't worry about writing it down now. I'm mainly going to be talking about verb placement, actually, in terms of word order today. And the first thing I'm going to just run through is some preliminaries to make sure that we're all on the same page before I start, because I'm not quite sure how many of you have done lots of linguistics or no linguistics or know much about German word order in general. Lots of you will know some of this anyway, but hopefully by the end of the preliminaries, you will feel that you know enough to cope with the rest of the lecture, I hope. And then after that, I'll talk about verb placement in the history of German. And I'll start by discussing the placement of the finite verb in what I've called declarative matrix clauses, but that just means main clauses. And then I'll talk about the placement of the finite verb in embedded clauses or subordinate clauses or dependent clauses, whatever you're used to calling them. Then we'll talk about the development of the post field. If you don't know what post field means, don't worry, because by the time we've looked at the preliminaries, you'll know what that means. We'll then talk about the order of the verbal cluster in embedded clauses. Again, that will become clear if you're not sure what that is. And then I'll move on to how some scholars have tried to account for variation and change in word order in the history of German. We'll have a very brief look at generative accounts, and it will be very theory light. We'll then talk about processes of change and look at the difference between inter and intra-speaker variation. I'll then touch on the notion of competing grammars. We'll finally look at some optional rules, and then I'll summarize it all at the end, and hopefully you'll all still be with me and understand what I've been talking about. Okay, so let's start with some preliminaries. Whenever you read any kind of work on German syntax or sentence structure, you're going to come across this concept of the sentence bracket schema, which gets called the Satzklammer, or the Satzklammermodell in German, sometimes called the topological model. And it looks a bit like this. It can be divided into 3 different subtypes, the first subtype of which can also then be subdivided, so I'll take you through it. And the idea is based on the fact that you have this left sentential bracket and a right sentential bracket, and those two are fixed, and everything else can sort of move around in the sentence. So this is modern German, right? So if we look at the main clause bracket, you have a main clause verbal bracket. In the first example, sie hat das Spiel nach nur 44 Minuten und 3 Sätzen verloren. And the idea is that your tensed auxiliary here is in the left sentential bracket and needs to be in that bracket. Your past participle is in the right sentential bracket. That could also be an infinitive, something else. You often have the subject in the prefill, but it doesn't have to be. It can be any other constituent, but it must only be one constituent. And then in the middle field, you get everything else, right? The main clause lexical bracket is similar, but instead of having a tensed auxiliary and past participle, or an auxiliary and an infinitive, you get often separable verbs. So here, zieht den Vorhang auf. your tensed separable verb ziehen is in the left sentential bracket, and your separable prefix goes in the right sentential bracket, and likewise the other constituents can go in the prefield or the midfield. You then get a main clause copular bracket, which is similar, and here we've got a phrase where there's an adjective in the right sentential bracket, sie wurde vorgestern krank, and then the tensed verb, the left sentential bracket. Again, those are fixed. You could mix around the middle field and the prefield, say vorgestern wurde sie krank, that's fine, as we know. Now you also get this nominal bracket, where instead of having anything in the prefield, you have the left sentential bracket filled with the determiner, in this case das, your right sentential bracket filled with your noun, Buch, and everything in the middle in your nominal phrase in the middle field. Das weltberühmte, aber leider vergriffene Buch. Similar to that, you have an embedded clause bracket where you get your complementizer or relative pronoun in the left sentential bracket, and the right sentential bracket's filled with tense verb, and in this case past participle as well, obwohl sie das Buch nie gelesen hatte. And in the nominal bracket and embedded clause bracket, you don't get anything in the prefield. And you notice that in the postfield, it's empty, right? This is sort of how the German sentence is often portrayed in the literature. And I've taken this from Nübling et al. 2017, which is a really great introduction to the history of German syntax. I really recommend that one if you don't know it already. Now, I've just said the postfield is usually empty, but you can fill it. Many of you will know if you spent any time in Germany, people fill it all the time. And here's an example, also from Nübling et al. 2017, but quoting former German Chancellor Angela Merkel in 1993, where she said, Wir Frauen müssen weitergehen auf dem Marsch durch die Institutionen. You might get some Germans who feel like, really, that postfield should be in the middle field, but that's probably a prescriptive drive, getting them to say that. We find it a lot in speech still. And spoiler, in the history of German, it's filled a lot more regularly as well, and we'll find that as we go through. In the history of German, we also find some problematic examples where this sentence bracket scheme doesn't seem to work. So here's an example from Sendbrief vom Dolmetschen, because I know it's one of your set texts for paper 4, where Luther has said, diejenigen, die noch nie haben Recht reden können. Now, what's strange about this, I've underlined the verbs there, is that the Recht is sort of in the middle of the verbal cluster, which sort of means it's in the right sentential bracket where we wouldn't expect it to be. We'd maybe expect it to be in the middle field. So this schema doesn't work all the time, especially not in the history of German. This should be very obvious to you as another preliminary. There are two options for tensed verb placement in matrix clauses in modern German. We all know this. Verb second in declarative matrix clauses and verb first in yes-no questions. I'm going to rattle through this because we learn this as foreign learners of German. You can say, ich habe gestern den Mann gesehen. You can say, gestern habe ich den Mann gesehen. But you cannot say, gestern ich habe den Mann gesehen. That's ungrammatical. If you're not familiar, the star just means it's ungrammatical. With questions, you have to say, kommst du heute? So the verb has to be in the first position. Du kommst heute is ungrammatical unless you're sort of repeating it as if someone's just said it and you're sort of echoing them. But to form a question, you have to put the verb in the first position in German. Obviously, in embedded or dependent subordinate clauses, modern German is verb final, weil ich den Mann sah, weil ich den Mann gesehen habe. And I've put the be example in there to show you that the tensed, in this case auxiliary, always comes at the end. It was not always so in the history of German. There are additional types of dependent clauses that take verb first order. So conditional clauses and wishes, and I think jokes as well, actually, sometimes. So here's a couple of examples. 5a, hast du Zeit, so werden wir bleiben. Möge der Versuch ihm gelingen. But by and large, we find, we find the pattern I just showed before with verb final for embedded clauses and verb second for main clauses. There is some variation in the model language. I've said this is modern. I mean, this is from 1700s, but we've still classed that as modern, right? So this is an example from a sermon, which is, I guess, a more spoken-oriented text type. And we find that the post field is filled here. Wisset ihr nicht, dass auf diesem Tag ein Fürst und Großer gefallen, das ist gestorben ist in Israel? In the modern sense, we might expect the in Israel to be in the middle field, but it's in the post field here, a bit like that Angela Merkel example we looked at before. But in the history of German, it was much more common to fill that post field even in texts, written down texts, although, as I said, sermons are more like spoken language than other text types, so it could be the case that we get filled postfields in more spoken-oriented registers. Anyway, okay, let's look at verb placement in the history of German. And we'll start with the placement of the finite verb in matrix clauses. There's more variation in earlier stages of German. You're going to find this with all the things I say to you. What's clear and fixed now was much less so in earlier stages. So the norm, though, is still for verb second, right? So here's some examples. I've included your other set text, Meyer Helmrecht, 7a, medieval, so Middle High German here. Mir hat ein Riecher getan. So there we've got the hat in second position, as we would expect it. And it's obviously second position in terms of constituents. If you look at 7b, we've got vor ihrem Tod ward sie sehr krank. So the vor ihrem Tod itself is one constituent, placing the wart in the left and central bracket, if you want to call it that, in verb second. And C just shows this even better because we've got a dummy subject. Es war ein Kind in einem Dorf zu Enterberg. I've taken those two examples from Ebert, 1986. It's quite dated these days, but is a sort of good introduction to the history of German syntax. It's got loads of examples in it. So if you're looking for another good book, I recommend that one. However, although the norm was V2, we do find that there was optional verb final placement in earlier stages of the language in matrix clauses. And we do get residual examples of this in German since the medieval period. 8a, dass sie nur Messe sungen in einer Kapelle an dem Pfingsttag das geschah. You probably wouldn't expect that geschah to be in final position in the modern language. Und in den Tagen die Leute suchend, and that's from Mental's translation of the Bible, Revelation 9, verse 6. Again, we would expect that suchend maybe to be in den Tagen suchend die Leute. However, you can explain a lot of this variation because often you get a verb final placement in matrix clauses when there are two stressed constituents appearing before the verb. So we find that even though it was very common to have V2 order, and we do get occasional verb third order, we do still find occasional verb third order or verb final order in the modern period, but really only in verse. You can get away with a lot of things in verse. So I've got an example from Parzifal, that's obviously earlier. Der wird ihn mit der Hand gefink, gesellig liecher dann entging. But you do find it in Faust 1 as well. Goethe, der Herr dich für ein Fräulein hält. But I think we can get away with a lot more in verse, so that's probably why we don't tend to get it in prose now. All that said, even if you go right back to Old High German, verb final word order is actually rare in matrix clauses. I've said clauses without complementizers here, but that's because Axel-Tober, who I'm taking this from, considers all matrix clauses to be clauses without complementizers. That's how she defines them. And she quotes Cichosz's 2010 quantitative corpus study, which is quite interesting because it shows that in 10% of declarative main clauses when they were non-conjoined just means they don't have an and or a but, joining them with something else. You find verb final order in translated prose, but only 1% in original prose. So lots of you will know that in Old High German, quite a lot of the literature existed or was written to support the understanding of Latin. So when it says translated prose, it's talking about Old High German prose that exists alongside a Latin, well, Latin was the original and the Old High German was a translation of it. So only in 10% of those cases do you get verb final word orders. They're not very common then. But actually in the original prose it's only 1%, which is even less. It's almost negligible, right? And Axel-Tober states that this idea of verb third word order has actually been massively overstated because it occurs so infrequently. And I've contrasted it there with Old English, for which the rate is 16% in original prose, still not huge, but quite a good deal more than 1% in Old High German. You can also get verb first order in matrix clauses in Old High German, though again it becomes less common towards the end of that period. It appears every so often in the medieval period, but then weirdly becomes more common in early New High German. Especially with verbs of speaking. And here are a couple of examples. So the first one here in 10a, is an Old High German example taken from Tatian. Waron tho hirta in theroland skefi. So the waron means were, basically, is the verb there. And then an early New High German example, which I've taken from Ebert, spricht nu das samaritische Weib zu ihm. And it's just a declarative matrix clause. It just means the same thing as we would now put it in verb-second, but it's in the first position. Now, Hinterholzen and Petrova did a bit of a deep dive into this in 2010, and they managed to show that the reason why this happens, well, it often happens in the context of introducing a new discourse reference. So when something new is being discussed, or it's a new episode, or at the start of a new text, or in a presentational sentence, you often get this verb-first order. Okay, let's look at the placement of the finite verb in embedded clauses. And by embedded clauses, I mean subordinate clauses. So we find that the modern account obviously being that we find it in verb final order. But between the 14th and the 17th century, the amount of verb final word order increases quite substantially in embedded clauses when they're introduced by subordinating conjunction. But this change didn't proceed into the same trajectory in all genres and across all groups, all social groups. So Ebert looks at texts in Nuremberg, I think in the early New High German period. I think that's when he did it. And he managed to find some quite interesting distinctions between social groups and verb final placement in embedded clauses. He found, I think it was, you have to check this, but I'm pretty sure it was that men who had had a university education and worked in administrative roles in the town used the most verb final word order in embedded clauses. And then I think it was men who didn't have a university education but worked in those roles had slightly less. And then I think it was nuns in convents who had slightly less than that. And I think students were below that. So he could sort of find a social explanation for the different use of or the different rates of use of verb final word order in embedded clauses. Lots of scholars have wondered, well, why do we suddenly get this increase in use in verb final word order in embedded clauses? And one hypothesis has been, well, how about the influence of Latin? Latin is known to be a verb final language. I'm not a Latinist, so I don't want to make claims that I can't back up, but certainly it has been hypothesized that that's the reason why. But actually, when we look at it in depth, there isn't any evidence that the Latin of the time predominantly had verb final word order in embedded clauses. And Ebert quotes a study by Solt in 1964, who looked at lots of different clauses, lots of different embedded clauses in Luther's Tischreden. I don't know if you're familiar with what they are, but they were sort of a collection of meetings, I suppose, Luther had around round table discussions, if you like, and were divided. Well, they were split into Latin and German. It sort of flipped between the two quite a lot. And Solt showed that the Das clauses in Luther's Tischreden, in 72% of them, they were verb final. But the kind of equivalent sort of clauses in Latin that were introduced by ut, or quod ut or ne, only had 27% verb final word order. So that's not a really great explainer for why we have that verb final word order in German if we're saying that Latin was what caused it. Because if Latin was influencing it, we would expect much higher in Latin than 27%, right? So that's probably not really why this is happening. I had a little comb through the Zendbrief to see if I could find whether Luther did any interesting things with his verb final placement in embedded clauses. And the vast majority, I only had a quick scan through, but the vast majority of them are verb final. But I did find this one where, and I've underlined the sentential brackets here basically. So the das is sort of the left sentential bracket. I'll read it out first. Mir ist indes genug und bin froh, dass meine Arbeit, wie St. Paulus auch rühmet, muss auch durch meine Feinde gefördert und das Luthers Buch und Luthers Namen unter seine Feinde Namen gelesen werden. We would expect that muss now to be in the right sentential bracket. It's sort of in the middle, right? But that's the only one I could see immediately when I had a quick scan through. let's look at the development of the post field. So the post field in German, which is called the Nachfeld, is not usually filled, as we saw, although you can fill it in speech. And there's quite a good deal of variation in the dialects as well. And again, if you're speaking to many Germans, you do find that those post fields get filled quite often in speech. We find that during the course of the history of German, the post field has been filled less and less. So the further back in time you go, the more common it is to find that post field filled. And it kind of goes hand in hand with what we were discussing just now about embedded clauses and verb final word order. Because if your post field is filled, obviously your clause is not verb final. So this is like the other side of the coin, if you like. So if you look at Notke, this was a late Old High German text. Over 40% of matrix clauses have filled post fields, and over 25% of embedded clauses do. And I've taken that statistic from Fleischer and Schallert, which is another great introduction to the history of German syntax that I do recommend. So that's clearly really different from the modern day, and even actually Luther's Sendbrief vom Dolmetschen. When I looked through, I could only find a handful. I mean, that particular one I showed you, that one example, and there's probably a couple of others of post fields that are not that didn't have verb final word order. And you don't tend to find a huge amount of those filled post fields now, but earlier on in the history of German, you did. It's quite interesting that Luther uses more filled post fields earlier on in his career and uses less or fewer of them later on. But not just that, depending on what kind of text type he's writing and what his audience is, he adjusts his post filled rate, if you like. So in his Bible translations, he fills his post fields much more commonly than he does in his other writing. And we might be able to hypothesize why this is. We know from the Sendbrief that Luther wanted to translate the Bible in a language that was like die Mutter im Hause. And if we know that post fields are even today more commonly filled in spoken language, it's not altogether surprising that he chose to fill his post fields more commonly in a translation where he's trying to speak like the people, right? But that's interesting for language change in general, that people can change their usage in the span of a lifetime as well, that he changes how he's speaking from earlier in his career to later, or how he's writing, I should say. So here's an example from his Bible translation. This is from the 1545 edition. Als aber der Speisemeister kostet den Wein. I've underlined those sentential brackets again, left and right. And your den Wein is obviously in the post field. We do find it in the Sendbrief as well. Denn wir haben ja gesehen, den Sudler zu Dresden, der mein Neues Testament gemeistert hat. I believe den Sudler zu Dresden is Hieronymus Emser. Is that right? Yeah, I have remembered it from 20 years ago. That den Sudler zu Dresden has been, we'd say extraposed or postposed to outside the middle field. Gets called ausgeklammert in German. And when I say that term, extraposed, I'm not making any theoretical claims about it moving from a kind of syntactic perspective. It's just the way that it's described as not being where you expect it to be now. Again, we find as we get more towards the modern period, the filling of the post field becomes even more uncommon in the written language. Hinterholzel 2010 does a good job of explaining why this post field can be filled in earlier stages of the language, and he explains it with recourse to information structural principles. Not sure how familiar you are with the term information structure, so the avoidance of doubt, I will just explain it briefly. It's the part of linguistics that looks at how information is packaged in a sentence and in what way it's packaged. So it's interested in new information versus old information, or sometimes called topic and focus, those kind of terms. So if we look at this example that we saw from Luther's Bible translation, als aber der Speisemeister kostet den Wein. This is from Hinterholz, so I've not invented this. The C stands for the complementizer. The background information is der Speisemeister. He's been talked about already in the context of the translation. So that's old news, right? Kostet being the verb, and then the focus, the new information, if you like, is den Wein, right? And to emphasize that, I suppose, it's put in the post field to fill it, according to Hinterholzer, 2010. Right, now let's look at the order of the verbal cluster in embedded clauses. Now, what do I mean by a verbal cluster? This will become immediately obvious as soon as I give you some examples. In modern German, 2 verb clusters, the order is 2-1. Right. This is obviously a part, just a clause here, a subordinate clause. Dass sie abreisen werden. You can't say, dass sie werden abreisen anymore. That is ungrammatical. Now, why have I put these little subscript numbers? It's because everybody else does it in the literature. I think it's numbered that way around because if it was in a main or matrix clause, the werden would be the furthest to the left, right? You say, sie werden morgen abreisen, right? So then it'd be 1 werden, 2 abreisen. When it's in a subordinate clause, that 1 gets put to the end, right? So that's why it's called 2-1 order. You can't get werden abreisen 1-2 order. And that's the same for other syntagms like the sein perfect, dass sie abgereist sind. You can't say, dass sie sind abgereist. Again with modals here, dass sie abreisen wollen. You can't say, dass sie wollen abreisen. And likewise with the haben perfect, dass sie gesagt haben. You can't say, dass sie haben gesagt. Taken all those examples from Fleischer and Schallert. In modern German, 3 verb clusters, it gets more complex. Okay. Now, as a German learner myself many years ago, I remember tearing my hair out about this because it seemed really complicated. It was even more complicated in the past. So you often have 3-2-1 order. So, dass sie abgereist sein werden. You can't say 1-3-2 order there. You can't say, dass sie abgereist werden. Dass sie werden abgereist sein. So that 3-2-1 order is normal, apart from sometimes, if you look at example C, you can have 1-3-2 order as well as 3-2-1 order. You can say, dass sie kommen können werden, or dass sie werden kommen können. And likewise with option D there, or example D, dass sie ihnen helfen können müssten, or müssten helfen können. And again, with the example E, which is one of those infinitives with lassen, dass sie mich kommen lassen haben or haben kommen lassen. But interestingly, in example F, you can't use 3-2-1, or you have to use 1-3-2, dass sie haben gehen müssen. I remember having to learn that as a learner of German. And that's quite interesting because it's crystallized into this pattern that it didn't used to have in the history of German. What about 4, 5, and 6 verb clusters? Well, the good news is I can't even pass some of them, they're so hard. I'm not even going to try. You get potentially 720 different options. And I found this example quoted in Fleischer and Schallert, which makes my brain hurt. And I maybe because I'm not a native speaker, I can't quite figure it out. But weil der Sack auf die Schultern hat müssen genommen worden sein können. Does that make sense to native speakers? I don't know, but
You can make it work.
You can make it work. The reality is you hardly ever get this many verbs in a verbal cluster, right? So not really people haven't really looked at it because they're so infrequent. However, in earlier stages of German, there was a huge amount more variation, as there is incidentally in modern Dutch. If any of you are Dutch speakers, you get a lot more variation there. So you could have 2-1, 1-2, 3-2-1, 1-2-3, 1-3-2, or 3-1-2. And it was all kind of as you like. There were some constraints on the variation, but it was all grammatical, if you like. Christopher Zapp has got a really, really nice study on this from 2011, which I really enjoy reading. I recommend it. And he looked at a corpus of early New High German and sort of counted all of these different verb clusters. And of the multi-verb clusters, the vast majority of them are 2 verb clusters. So forget the 4, 5, 6, 7 ones. Even the 3 verb clusters are really not that common because 94.2% of those verb clusters are just 2 verbs. So that makes life a bit easier. Interesting, in Middle High German, you get 2-1 order. So that's the modern norm, about 50% of the time, which obviously means you then get 1-2 order about 50% of the time. So it's really up to you whether you wanted to say abgereist sind or sind abgereist. Here's an example from Barngart. Wann wisse nicht, wie übermär wer kommen. we would expect gekommen wäre now, or kommen wäre, and that's 1-2 order there. And you'll find this in Helmrecht, it's everywhere in Helmrecht, 1-2 order all the time. So in Sapp's study, he has managed to explain quite a lot of that variation. And he shows that the 1-2 order, so that's the order that is not standard for modern German, so ist gemacht or wird gemacht, he found that it's favoured by quite a lot of different factors. I'm not going to have time to go through all of these different factors, but I'll briefly mention them. So the different type of syntagm, so that refers to what kind of structure really. So ones with infinitives like wird kommen would often favour a 1-2 order. If you had any preceding heavy words, and by that I sort of mean prosodically heavy, so think longer words basically, the 1-2 order would often be preferred. Any preceding non-pronominal, I've said NPs, they're noun phrases. So if you've got a non-pronominal noun phrase, it also tends to be quite heavy, right? So we're looking at prosodically heavy things. When you have those prosodically heavy things, you tend to get the 1-2 order, and that's not surprising if you think about it, because the one in this case is usually a monosyllable, right? It's like ist or hat, sometimes haben, but it's lighter, if you like, than a past participle or the infinitive, right? Object focus, so another information structural principle there. Stressed prefixes, so like verbs like zukommen or mitmachen, those kind of ones. When you have verbs with those, you tend to find that 1-2 word order is favoured. And extraposed arguments, that's when we're talking about filling your post field. If you remember I was talking about that, extraposed, again you find 1-2 order. So I've just got an example here for the first factor mentioned, syntagm. So for 55% of infinitive plus other verb syntagm, so if you think like wird kommen or something, had 1-2 order in early New High German. By contrast, the Sein passives only 10.6% did, and only 22.6% of haben perfects, so gemacht hat, right? Only 22.6% of those had 1-2 orders, that would be hat gemacht. So that you can sort of see that there are different things going on here that are affecting this order. It's not completely random variation, right? And in fact, Christopher Zapp showed that of the 1-2 clauses in Middle High German, so that's not the modern standard now, it's the ist kommen, 93.4% of those clauses in Middle High German could be explained by at least one of those prosodic factors that we just looked at, so those ones there. That's almost all the variation captured, which is pretty neat. He also argued that the development of the 2-1 order resulted from the fact that this variant was adopted as the norm in chancery style, which was a style of writing associated with administrative circles in courts and cities, and which developed sort of supra-regionally. And as it developed, it took this variant 2-1 in embedded clauses along with it. Now, Sapp did also look at 3 verb clusters, but if you recall, over something like, I think it was over 90% of all the verb clusters were 2 verb clusters. So there's many, many fewer tokens of 3 verb clusters. He couldn't make a lot of draw a lot of conclusions from what he investigated, but what he did find is that 3-2-1 order is rare in Middle High German, which is quite interesting because that's the modern norm now for most, in most cases. The 1-2-3 order increases greatly from the 12th and 13th centuries, and that's interesting because we don't get 1-2-3 order at all now in Standard German. The Infinitivus pro participio, which is the example of like hat die Kinder spielen lassen, favours a 1-2-3 order in early New High German. So that would be dass die Kinder, let me get this right, hat lassen spielen. That was the order favoured in early New High German. But most other syntagms favour 3-2-1 and 1-3-2 in early New High German, which is the pattern we get in the modern day, so isn't so surprising. Right, I'm going to look now at accounting for variation and change. And we'll start by talking about generative accounts. I think most of you have done prelims linguistics. Yes? No? No? Great, okay, I'm going to row back. So that's fine. Syntactic theory. I probably haven't done much syntactic theory then. Okay, so syntactic theory likes to be deterministic. It likes to say if you have a set of conditions, then this output happens, right? So given a certain starting point, there is a blind application of a series of procedures. Now, I've said here, for example, V to C movement in declarative matrix clauses. That's going to sound scary, and you get even more scared when you see this looking tree. Don't panic about it. I'm not going to go into massive amounts of detail about it, but the idea is that you can separate out, this is modern German, main and embedded clauses from each other by suggesting that your verb moves to C only in main clauses. And the reason why it moves to C only in main clauses is because there's nothing in C. C stands for complementizer, right? So if there's a complementizer there, which is like your obwohl or your das or your relative pronoun, if that's filled, then it can't move there. It has to stay down at the bottom, is the idea. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's the general gist, right? So Jaeger et al. 2018 is quite a theoretical collection of essays on the history of German word order. And she suggests that modern German looks a bit like this. And the idea is that your verb is, so in this case, is base generated down in V, and it sort of moves to I, which stands for inflection first, and there's various theory internal reasons why she argues this, and then it moves to C when C is not filled. But if your C is filled because it's base generated with it's got a complementizer or some other thing in it like das or obwohl, then your verb can't move, and that's how we can say, oh look, our two clauses, main and matrix and embedded clauses are different because this movement, this V to C movement doesn't happen. But if that C is not filled, V to C movement always happens. That's kind of the deterministic view of, I'd say, mainstream Chomskyan, this is minimalism basically, theory, linguistic theory. Obviously, if I go back to that, when you look at the left uppermost part of the clause, there's only one space for one constituent, which tallies with what we've seen in the topological knowledge, or that Satzklammer model, right? The prefill can only be filled by one constituent. But when you have a verb that's not in second position in earlier stages of the language, you've got more than one constituent to the left of it, right? So that's a problem for this tree structure. There's nowhere for it to go, right? What do we do? Well, we draw a new one. So there's got to be a different clause structure for earlier forms of German. So says Jaeger, actually I think it's Axel-Tober, 2018 says this, sorry. And she talks about a clause type called hanging nominatives and pronouns to the left of the finite verb. We're not going to go into too much detail about what hanging nominatives are, but all you need to know is that they sort of have a pronoun on the left, in the left sort of for the sentence, and then sort of resumptive pronoun again, so the ihr and the ihr. This is an old High German example from Taschen. And all you need to know by looking at this is your verb habet is underlined, and there's more than one constituent to the left of it. And the constituents here she's highlighted by square brackets, right? So you can't have that tree that we just saw with only one constituent to the left of your verb, right? And here are some examples of pronouns to the left of the finite verb. So, Erinner porton ich verschnisso in 19a, I will destroy iron portals. You've got iron portals, I destroy. You've got no verb second there, right? So again, and the other examples are doing exactly the same thing. You've got more than one constituent to the left of your main verb. So how do we cope with that? Well, Axel-Tober 2018 suggests, okay, let's take Kiparski's 1995 model for Old English and try and apply it to Old High German. And basically what he did was say, well, we still move our verb to C because we don't want to lose that nice theoretical explanation of verb second, which accounts for 90% or 95% plus of all our sentences. But instead, let's split our CP, which CP stands for complementizer phrase, and when it says topic there, that's a kind of information structural node, if you like. And that way you can see XP just stands for any kind of constituent that goes there. You've got two slots for your constituents to go left of the verb. So you don't have to abandon your V to C movement, which theoretically is pleasing because you spent a lot of time trying to argue for that. You can create another slot, if you like. And this is based on a lot of other work that's kind of theory internal that had already split the CP in previous work. So it works quite nicely. So Axel-Tober then argues, well, structurally, the finite verb has to be in C, because, as we mentioned above, the grammar of Old High German was already largely subject to generalized V to C movement, which is really just a theoretical way of saying we've got V2 95% of the time, right? So we want to say that this works really well to describe it or to explain it. We don't want to lose it. But to me, it's a bit like saying I really want to hold on to this theoretical principle that works really well. I don't want to let go of it, but I still got some variation. It doesn't quite fit in with it, and it's a bit frustrating. So variation is always alternative ways of saying the same thing. Verb 1 and verb 3rd, word order was optional in earlier stages of German. How can we reconcile this with the fact that our theory wants to be deterministic? Why is it sometimes that we get the split CP and sometimes we don't? Let's talk about processes of change before we try to answer that question. When languages undergo a change, we usually get this sort of idealized S-shaped curve. It looks like this, right? So you get a period of variation between variants. So your new variant starts off down at the bottom, 0%. Not used very much. Often it's actually a variant that's already available, but used much, much less. And then it sort of speeds up in its rate of use quite quickly, and then it sort of slows down and plateaus. And this happens with lots of different kinds of change in lots of different languages, cross-linguistic. So that's the kind of expectation that we have and what happens in language change. And we get two different kinds of variation. We get inter-speaker variation, and that is variation between speakers. So speaker A has variant X, speaker B has variant Y, and the variation is quite easy to cope with. If you have one person doing one thing and one person doing another, you can say, well, fine, they've just got different dialects or different grammars. We don't have a problem with that variation. That's not an issue. Obviously, intra-speaker variation is when you get variation within the usage of a single speaker. So here's an example. I'm a native English speaker. I literally don't know when I say wash up the dishes versus wash the dishes up. Maybe there's some way I can explain that variation according to information structural or prosodic factors. I don't know, but that is an example. And in fact, we look at Luther when we're talking about his trajectory over time and how he changes his use of filling the post fields. That is variation within a single speaker, intra-speaker variation. It's more problematic for generative theory, right? Because our generative theory likes to be deterministic and say, if this happens, then this happens. But it doesn't always happen. So how have people tried to get around that problem? Well, there was a very influential paper by Anthony Kroch in 1989. He said, well, hang on, variation, it's not a problem, it's not a phenomenon within the grammar. It's actually the result of bidialectalism or bilingualism. So just like you might have a speaker who can speak 2 or more languages and has 2 different grammars in their mind, when you have variation, it's just multiple grammars, right? So one variant is said to belong to one grammar, and the other variant is said to belong to the second grammar. And these grammars basically compete with each other until one grammar eventually wins out, and the new form almost completely replaces the old. So when we saw that S-shaped curve, that could happen over the course of a speaker's life, and it's a competing grammar explanation. If we think about some of the examples we were looking at in terms of the verb clusters and Christopher Sapp's work in embedded clauses, does that mean we have to have multiple different grammars for all the different variants? Grammar 1, 1 through 3, grammar 2, 1 through 2, etc. And, let's not even get into the 4, 5, and 6 verb clusters where we get 720 different options. Seems a little bit unlikely. Multiple grammars are arguably not very learnable. Whatever kind of grammars we have or we acquire have to be learnable by children. We also find that there's an absence of code switching in these examples of Krochian diglossia. So code switching is where you switch between 2 different, usually, languages, if you were a bilingual speaker, but it tends to happen according to certain constraints. So for example, there's a constraint called the equivalence constraint. You'd only swap within a sentence at a place where the sort of surface grammars, if you like, of the 2 languages match. And you don't tend to get that kind of constraint happening in these purported examples of Krochian syntactic diglossia. So it doesn't really match up with bilingualism either. And it doesn't allow for stable variation across long periods of time. I mean, we're looking at changes here in the history of German that have been going on for potentially millennia. If you think about verb-second, it's getting more and now it's fixed as verb-second in German in matrix clauses, and there was more variation in the past, but I mean, that has happened over a huge amount of time. So how about optional rules? Optionality is what results when the grammar doesn't mind. This is from Biberauer and Richards, 2006. Well, how about we just say, okay, well, sometimes this happens and sometimes that happens. So in our two verb clusters, we might say, well, okay, the verb raising is optional. When the verb raising applies, we get the 1-2 order, and when it doesn't, we get 2-1 order. Optionality is obviously necessarily non-deterministic. To me, it just doesn't really explain it, right? It's also true that maybe there isn't any optionality truly. Maybe we've just not found the cause of the variation yet. We looked at Christopher Zapp's work on the verbal cluster, and he found that so much of that variation could be explained by appealing to other factors like information structure or prosody. Perhaps we just haven't found that for some of the things where the variation is still occurring. And it is true, other linguistic factors usually affect syntax variation, which we saw in Zapp and Hinterholzer. We can also talk of sociolinguistic and stylistic tendencies. And we were talking about Ebert's work on Nuremberg texts and seeing how different social groups used verb final placement different amounts of the time. So variation, we could say, doesn't have to belong to the core grammar. We're just going to leave it to the periphery. Grammar doesn't need to worry about this thing. And it is also sadly true that we might just never find out in the case of historical data because we're so limited by text type and the amount of text we have and the kind of text it is, and we don't have access to psycholinguistic experiments that synchronic linguists do, which is difficult. Okay, I'm going to summarize. The main things we discussed today is that word order basically becomes more fixed over time, right? Especially with regards to the sentential bracket, that Satzklammer. So your matrix, your main, and embedded subordinate clauses become more distinct from each other over time. They start off being a bit more, you can't quite tell them apart. Sometimes when you read older text in German, you can't be sure whether it is a main clause or an embedded clause. But over time, we get them to becoming much more distinct from each other. Overall, we find that variation in word order decreases over time. So it is true that modern dialects have more variation. I'm talking about Standard German. Big disclaimer. We have also seen that variation can often be explained by prosodic, information structure, or sociolinguistic factors. We can capture a lot of that variation. Variation can pose a challenge for generative theory, which likes to be deterministic. There are ways around this, and there are a lot of people that work on a lot of different models to try and capture this variation. I haven't talked about it because I haven't had time, but there's a really quite well-known theory called optionality theory within phonology that has been used by syntacticians. It's kind of where you rank constraints, and you can use that to sort of suggest, well, this variant's more likely to happen in this kind of situation, and it works quite well. So there are people working on these things, and it's not that you have to be completely nihilistic about it, but it is tricky for generative theory. And that's it. In terms of references, I would say if you're looking for a good introduction to the history of German syntax, Fleischer and Charlotte is a great start. If you're looking generally for a good German introduction to the history of German, I think Nübling et al. Is a really good one. Any other questions? Feel free to ask.
That was brilliant. Many thanks. And I was particularly pleased to see as first reference there Katrin Axel-Tober, who did in her second semester her first Old High German pro seminar with me in Tübingen. She knew already then more about Old High German than I do know, but it's nice to see students going on to do great things. So I expect all of the paper 4 students in the room to return in 15 years to give a lecture on perhaps pronouns of address or language change. And that's it for this term with historical linguistics. I'll see the finalists for some revision next term. Make good use of Canvas, because you'll see also some other people who have gone on to great things. So Simone Schulz-Ballouf, who did the lecture series in 2006 16 has now the chair for historical linguistics at Halle University. She was a postdoc on the Lunar project then, and Alderic Blom, who was lecturing on that, is professor of Celtic studies at Marburg, so paper 4 is a good place,
Place to start.
to get going. All right, to those who aren't stuck with me on paper 3, enjoy the term break and see you in trade term.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.